Just some formalities to start to kick off. This webinar is recorded. We have a Q&A that you can use. Please post your question. Don't post quotes, they will not be handled. Questions can be upvoted, so if you see a question that you really have an interest to, please click on the like. We do not handle any posts or questions that are put in the chat box, sorry. We also have some polls, and the participation is from that anonymous. You will receive after this webinar a link with the recordings and the presentations, so you can have some backup on this part. The webinar is shared by other people. This means that they not necessarily represent the views or policies of the Interreg North Sea region, neither the SEEV4-City or individual participants. So, the agenda of today, we have following agenda. We start with Richard Kotter of the Northumbria University of Newcastle. We go to Amsterdam, we go to Leicester, we move on to Oslo, and we close off with Avere with an European point of view. Richard will give also an introduction what the SEEV4-City projects were standing for. They have been running for some years now. And we are about to end this project, so we can finally go to the recommendations of this. And today we handle especially the policy recommendations. So Richard, are you there?
Yes, indeed, I'm here. So, yeah. So can you hear me? So should I?
Yeah, you're there, of course.
My video.
We can start up the video as well.
Yeah, I've just got permission from you to do that, and then I'll.
The floor is yours.
Yes, I can't share my screen because you share your screen, or someone else, it says.
I will do that.
Yeah. So, so hopefully it does do it now. Yep. And then.
Technique is wonderful.
Data, yeah.
If it works.
Yeah, yeah. If we did practice earlier, it should work.
Yeah.
Come on.
I hope we get your full attention. I see that in Europe, in the most places, it's excellent weather. So I think it's tempting for many people to go outside. So
cold inside, warm outside. Yes. So it's trying to connect to my OneDrive, which is slow. This is now happening. Yeah. For some reason, it doesn't want to do it now. You got my presentation as PDF, Philip?
In PDF, I'm not so sure actually.
It doesn't matter whether it's PDF or not, but
yeah, I will open it. Straight.
So basically, it's 3.5 years almost of the project. So we're coming to the end, and there's a whole range of reports and deliverables which are and will be available by certainly the end of June on the SEEV4-City website, and we will share the material through the SEEV4-City website, since we have targets for sharing that actively, people requesting that. So as Philip said, it's a project which has operational pilots at the core. In fact, it's 6 operation pilots in 5 countries. And
for some
yeah,
reason, it's coming up. So the
it's
bad
coming
stuff
up, right?
there.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I don't know what. And what the task is for all of the partners transnationally is to analyze, support the pilots, put them in context, see if we can indeed scale matters up transnationally, whether these ideas, business models, technical solutions are shareable and useful for other projects. So as Philippe said, today, these are the goals of the project. So you can see basically three overall ones, which has one to do with energy autonomy, really, and we mean electrical energy autonomy. But it's not quite self-sufficiency necessarily, because of course we focus on energy services, including energy services for the grid, but also, if you like, behind the meter or other forms of self-consumption. It's clean transport or clean mobility, and also avoiding or deferring grid investments, which otherwise might be necessary, low voltage or medium voltage. And the results should really help others, societally speaking, business, enterprise, organizations, populations, in terms of combine clean, ultra-low emission electric transport services and renewable energy, hopefully some new business models, business ideas, and we've actually, in our own project, even generated new business for some of our partners. And you can't do any of that without organizational, social acceptance, management, appropriate management, and policy frameworks. And the EU policy framework, my colleague Jason from EVER will cover quite extensive later on. So if we go on, can you flick on? Yeah, so, but does that mean we have to look at costs, different kind of costs, internalizing costs? Absolutely, and that means the electric vehicle and maybe even the stationary storage, the energy storage. And what does it mean to be having business models? Feasible means they're affordable now and in the future, maybe hopefully even profitable. SEEV4-City as a project works at different scales and different combinations of technical, organizational, different partners and so on. It's all around, in this case, around solar energy, but also other renewable energy imported in from the grid at times. Electricity is going up with electrification of transport and also building infrastructure and so on, of course. So EV integration shouldn't be a problem, but has to be handled in a certain way, and then actually presents a whole range of opportunities. Next one. But electric mobility and also energy services will only be profitable or competitive if the total cost of ownership or use is modified, in other words, reduced, even after internalizing all of the cost to make it comparable and more beneficial in terms of other types of solutions in these different sectors. Energy aggregators is being looked in and has to be also be solved. Next one. My colleague Jason from EVER will cover quite a bit of this as well. And this is, of course, policy influence, but also is to do with research and development, the industry and advances. And the EV is part of an ecosystem. So is indeed different kind of energy storage systems. And one development in certain areas and breakthrough may affect other areas. And that hopefully becomes a virtuous rather, not a vicious cycle. Next one. Go on. Yeah. So here is a generic business model which we develop, which then gets fine-tuned and adapted to by the operational pilot partners and then is being analyzed. And there's a report coming out by the end of this June, which is overall, but also what we derive, what we learn, and also what we propose for in moderation adapted or proposed for the different operational pilots. basically quite complicated, different partners, different stakeholders who all want to and have to get benefit out of this. Not just a couple of stakeholders, but many, many of these different types of stakeholders, both across energy and transport. That gives you different business model pillars, as indeed is in line with the key performance indicators of the project overall. So I mentioned clean or low carbon or ultra low carbon, mobility, but also, of course, the electricity and energy sector as well. Energy autonomy to the degree which it's beneficial of a different operation pilot or context or business model, because there's trade-off to be made. Benefits for the grid, both locally, but also centrally at all these three different levels. And then the modified total cost of ownership and use, which needs to make the whole thing more competitive. Next one. So here's the first sort of thing, and I refer you to 2 full reports, final reports, which are coming out this month, what we call the state-of-the-art review of across all of these domains, and that's coming up through the project website. But essentially, what this says, if you have different key performing indicators, which I've alluded for earlier, policy may hopefully make a difference. The regulatory policy, stimulation, disincentive context will make a difference to all of these different types of pillars of the business model. So policy can enhance and stimulate and support, and that may be and is of course needed temporarily and then permanently in an affordable way. And there's some trade-offs which have to be done and made. The business model depends which you develop what you're looking at. So if you're looking at the charging infrastructure, for instance, it may be important to segment and see who actually might want to be partake or use or co-own or is needing to derive a profit from your solution, from your infrastructure. Jason will cover some of that at a EU level later on. And that really means you have different sort of types of opportunities. Okay, and that has to be done and segmented. Next. There's a new CENIX report coming up on this score. What it means is that you have to look at vehicle for energy services and actually energy services for the grid, if that's what you're targeting, and that's what the project in part is about. You may well have to stack that to, in other words, to target several ones at the same time, which are not in competition and contract each other at any one time, but you have to have the right customer, organizational, households, social groups, and so on, business. For that, the CENIX report will come up. There's one which I reference here, which has, at least for the UK and vehicle to grid, these kind of different kind of target groups where that is quite applicable V2G. So you have to do these market analysis and target group. Next one, for these services. Sustainable urban mobility plans have been around. Not everyone has that in terms of local authorities and cities and so on. In fact, in some countries now it's mandatory in order to get any kind of national European funding in terms of clean transportation. In other countries it's not. And of course some cities have different kind of policy planning and ways to get to somewhere like this field other than through a SUMEP. This project, SEEV4-City, is developing a different kind of framework, which we call SUMEP, which is the energy planning and the mobility planning or transport planning integrated as best as can be done. These are some key concepts of SUMEP. We've been there for a while, but many cities are still working on them. Next one. There's 8 principles, and from a transport or mobility perspective, you shouldn't violate any of them, and they're absolutely crucial and fundamental. So if you want, as a city, as a local authority, or a society, make advances forward, then you shouldn't be doing anything on the energy or electrification which conflicts with these key principles, or do it in a way which is inconsistent. Next one. So do we need this new sort of type of framework which we're developing as part of this project, sustainable urban and energy, mobility and energy plans? Well, there's guidebooks around, SEEP, CCAP, and there's a new updated SUMP 2.0 framework and plan and guidelines. And there's all sorts of topic guides and practitioner guidance, some of which now in 2019 address electrification as well. Next one. Yes, we do, because, and there's actually other European projects coming up, still going on, new ones starting up, which are trying to do the same, which we hopefully can feed into. Quick point here, the CCAP. The CCAP one is basically presented as a planning process. The SUMP is presented as a cycle. I think you have to have both. A cycle, of course, means with changing energy profiles, with different technologies, with different transportation and mobility needs, you will have to start always, not from scratch, but again, continuously. So you're in a cycle. Do you have to have endpoints in terms of actually quality outcomes? Yes, also. So you need both a process and a cycle. You can't have just one of them. Next one. So if you check the SEEP and the CCAP, the SEEP Sustainable Energy Action Plan, which many local authorities have put forward, running towards contribution by 2020, and the CCAP, which has climate action in there for 2030, then what do we need to do? Is it fully covered? There's SUMEPS stuff, the green stuff, which is covered in there, but it's not fully covered. And actually, emergency planning and disaster management is sort of more hinted at, with more variable climate and impacts and so on in the CCAP, but it's not yet fully addressed. The way in which this gets monitored and done is a bit different, and that also makes a difference. And note, this is not just council building, this is everything, and it's both across mobility and energy now. Next one. What typically doesn't get done in a sustainable energy action plan, but should be done and has to be done now, which is implicitly in a SUMP, a sustainable urban mobility plan, is basically socioeconomic dimensions and social equity or social justice issues or access. So basically you need to talk about energy sufficiency and also transport mobility sufficiency at a minimum for certain social groups, because of course it connects to jobs and opportunities and social life and so on as well. The SEEP is interesting because it has a baseline emissions inventory which is relevant, and the city of Murcia has done one on solar generated and so on. How long does this stuff take? Well, years. Stockholm says they've been doing this kind of stuff for 10 plus years on the left, and they're not quite there yet. Other cities are doing this, and maybe by 2030, there is some more harmonized monitoring across these fields. And there are projects, European projects, which are concluded and going on, which were exactly on that score, the Simpla and the SUMPUP project and so on. And then you get into the specifics of some interventions, which are actually going into new generation. So urban vehicle access rules means they're now done differently. They're more dynamic. They're more low carbon targeted. They have different type of objectives. That needs to be coupled with basically smart city thinking, which my colleague Jason will also cover a bit, and different types of form of transport, mobility, different kind of platforms, different kind of ownership models. So all of these technical streams have to be integrated with each other. And that essentially is regulation and policy as well. Go on. Next one. This kind of discussion also, just to dip in for just very briefly into parking. Urban parking is changing, provision of urban space is changing, but will electric vehicles have, relatively speaking, a provision for them which is differential to ICEs? can cause problems and conflicts, such as in Trondheim in Norway, for instance. But basically, there's a whole range of projects now which consider low mobility vehicles or EVs as a different kind of kettle of fish. What they don't yet consider is how to do the energy and the energy services and energy balancing around car parking and car parking projects. That is something which is starting up now. So it's not just about technology, digitalization and so on. It's actually about framing and opportunities and regulation. Next one. And if you actually look at Norway, Norway has, for instance, as one of the countries, put a quota in there, quite a low one, 6% of all parking lots and parking garages have to have a minimum 6% provision for EVs. That probably should be high in the future. But it means you have to look at provision and parking pricing and energy pricing, and maybe look at the way in which you put these platforms aggregated out there and trade with them in terms of energy to the grid, and that can provide opportunities, needs to link in then with the infrastructure and the regulation and the access regulation and provisioning. Next one. This is just what we're doing as a project, so you'll see that in the final report. You can look for these practitioner guides, the latest one on electrification, for instance, in SUMEPS. They cover quite a range of things, all types of vehicles, for instance. What they don't tell you is quite how to electrify, a bit on charging infrastructure, but certainly they don't tell you on carbon intensity and renewable energy and connecting that in. So that is actually where this project and others coming up hopefully need to make a contribution and will make a contribution. So as a planner, as an energy planner, and as a transport mobility planner, and actually as an urban planner integrated, cities are coming up with varied answers to some of these questions. The questions on the left are actually questions which are derived from the topic guide for electrification from SUMEPS. And the answers are different, and they've been differently developed and tested and rolled out and evaluated, including in new transport plans, energy plans, and European projects. And there's different ones out there. Birmingham City Council, for instance, is talking about traffic cells and no through traffic for anything like personal vehicles, maybe with the exception of EVs, we'll see. Suburban eccentric, so don't forget the suburban environments. Go back, the suburban environments. And on the right hand, the idea of scale is important. It's of course commuting, it's the urban hinterland, it's the metropolitan area, but also going into discrete parts of cities or super blocks, for instance, and Green Charge down there on the right is another one which is actually alongside the Meister project, which is exploring how to bring renewable energy and electric vehicles into that at different kind of scales. So you're talking at all different scales in cities. You're talking about integrated urban planning. How do you do that? How do you become strategic, longer term? What steps should you take? And again, cities are coming up with different answers. Bremen, for instance, has an e-mobility strategy quite well established now, quite across the board, but also a green master plan. A master plan is just one type of instrument to do that, and that brings energy and renewable energy in as well. Umeå in Sweden is actually saying, well, actually, maybe we should, like as many of the other cities, actually put, for now, our emphasis on innovation, testing out developing innovation, including social innovation, societal innovation, social acceptance. These are some other examples here. Gdynia in Poland has not yet got the funding and is searching for the funding. Glasgow has a whole range there. Groningen and Aberdeen actually saying, well, maybe the answer is in part hydrogen and fuel cells, not just electric mobility. And we actually will want to transition over to hydrogen. The point is here that actually you're looking at carbon intensity of electric vehicles. And where does that come from? In large share, also from the grid electricity generation sources, if it's centrally generated. The carbon intensity can be monitored, is reasonably transparent, including for the UK. There's public APIs, and citizens, if they're supported and educated, can actually look at this kind of material and can be framed, next one, in terms of communication. This is northeast of England. This was Monday, I think, and you see in the northeast of England, for instance, a very large share of nuclear energy for the central grid. On the right, you see that actually you have different kind of contributions there. Solar is not insignificant, but when solar happens is time dependent, certain types of the day. So even in the northeast of England, you can make advances there, and certainly have, if you have locally generated solar or wind, as opposed to centrally from the grid. So just communication and framing and engagement with community groups, with organization, public organization, user groups is absolutely essential. And the MyGrid UK dashboard, or Great Britain actually, dashboard, for instance, is one such portal, and others exist in different North Sea region countries. Technology doesn't solve itself. You need to take people along. My colleague Jason will talk about green deals as part of what the future holds from the European Commission, the European Union, but of course we're facing recessions in the UK, in Germany, in Europe. So will that be solved, all of these fields, will that be solved just by technology, by smart technology, by artificial intelligence, by algorithms, and by apps? The answer is, and here's my only London example at the top, UPS has many more plans and will continue those plans to actually have trading with the grid and renewable energy integration in logistics. And that is done increasingly by artificial intelligence and apps. Great. But what we found, and this is a key publication from our PhD student here, what we found is an algorithm doesn't decide fully for itself. You actually have to feed it with principles, negotiation, and cooperation. An algorithm is essentially a support system, an automated support system which is programmed. An algorithm or an app doesn't give you a final or best answer, including in these fields of bringing mobility and energy and grid and energy autonomy together. It has to be done with different stakeholders, negotiated, and of course, only then will you have shared benefits and will it be profitable, so to speak, not for just one party, but for all of these different stakeholders. And that's, I think, it for me. Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. Very interesting point of views. For the moment, I don't see any questions in the Q&A box. So people, if you have questions for Richard, please post them. Meanwhile, I will give you the word to Sarah Holsen from North Sea Region Interreg. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And thank you, Richard. We'll take a step back from Richard's presentation to a bit of the wider view from the North Sea Region Program's perspective. One of our cornerstones is policy influence. Because we distribute EU funds, it's always good to see that the impacts of the projects we fund go beyond the location of a specific pilot, or go beyond the limited readership of a state-of-the-art report. We want to ensure that the positive effects of our projects are not limited to the partnership only, but communicated to the most important stakeholders in order to assure a durable legacy after the end of a project. The North Sea Region Program currently funds 73 projects. Not all of these explicitly deal with policy impact. Some, actually many we find, end up dealing with policy indirectly as they're going through implementation, but very few actually put it into their application. The SEEV4-City project is one of 9 of our projects to include an actual objective on policy contributions and legislation, contributions to legislation, and one of only 12 to include an entire work package on this. And Richard was speaking about that with his business models and so forth. Therefore, out of necessity, the partners in this project have pushed themselves to step into the policy arena from many angles, at both the local and national levels, as well as the regional. They talk with policymakers, provide policymakers with reports and studies about the energy grid, charging infrastructure, and the like. And this makes a big difference. 2 examples, and I'll only hold myself to 2 because you will be hearing from several after this presentation that have stood out to us are, for example, KU Leuven's team, which organized and participated in meetings with the Flemish government bodies to discuss regulations for driving as well as charging. In addition, Senex in the UK has represented the UK in the European e-mobility ICT interoperability initiative to help develop standards for EV charging, which are now extending to V2G. So these are just 2 of the examples that we have been able to read about in the reports that SEEV4-City has submitted to us. And there are many, many more. In the areas of green transport and renewable energy, the focus for our program during this program period, 2014 to 2020, was to increase pilots and trials that promote electric vehicles and other zero-emission vehicles, including the development of infrastructure to support their use, as well as the use, of course, of wind, solar, and other forms of energy. SEEV4-City has excelled in both of these areas with their myriad pilot projects and academic studies covering all of the different partner countries. In the next program period, there will be a significant focus on how our projects can contribute to the European Green Deal. Richard mentioned that, and I believe Jason will be talking about it in his presentation. And this project, SEEV4-City, if it had a follow-up, would be very well placed to make contributions in that area as well. That's all I have to say at this point, but I look forward to the next few presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for your contribution and you're giving your insights on your point of view. So we're hopping over to Amsterdam. We have 2 great speakers from the city of Amsterdam. Art van de Giessen and Jaap Burger. Welcome.
Thank you, Philippe, and thanks everybody for joining today. I will try to share my screen.
Yeah.
Can you see this?
This goes immediately, so happy for that. No technical issues this time.
Yes, this works?
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Perfect. So again, welcome everybody. This will be a dual presentation from my colleague Jaap Burger and me, and we will take you along in our sustainability policies and indicate why this project SEEV4-City was important for us, is important for us, and how it helps us in shaping and making our policy. And to do this, I will tell you first about our roadmap, Amsterdam Climate Neutral 2050. This roadmap is hot from the press actually, because it was accepted only 2 weeks ago by our city council, and it's our ambition document for the long term in Amsterdam. It states what we want to achieve on CO2 reduction: 95% in 2050, 55% in 2030. But not only it sets an ambition for the long term, it also includes all the actions for the short term. So we describe actually the most important elements of our strategy for launching the transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy. I guess I don't have to tell you why we do this. I guess there are people from all over the world, and I guess most people know that Amsterdam and the Netherlands are below sea level. So there's a good reason to work on this. We also see the temperature rising in cities. Amsterdam sees calculated the temperature might rise by 3 degrees Celsius. And in 2050, we expect to have more than 20 tropical nights per year, where we have 7 now. So this is all good reasons to work on CO2 reduction. And it's and Amsterdam, the city of Amsterdam, wants to take its responsibility in this. Then what is the challenge of Amsterdam when it comes to CO2 reduction? What we did in our roadmap is also we calculated where all the emissions come from in Amsterdam. And we did this for the built environment, for mobility, for electricity, and also for harbor and industry. And as you can see in these graphs, actually since 1990, CO2 greenhouse gases emissions have risen to almost 5.5 kilotons coming from 5.5 thousand kilotons coming from 3,800 kilotons. So actually there was a big rise. And what does that mean? That means that if we want to reduce 55% compared to 1990, we have to reduce current emissions by 70% almost. So that is a big challenge we have. What we have also calculated is what does it mean if all the actions we have described in our roadmap, if we take them, and all the measures by the central government are taking, by the municipality itself, but also by companies and institutions, can we reach this 55% reduction which we aim at? And we calculated that if we take all the actions now, we are at 48% reduction in 2030. So the goal is within reach. The project SEEV4-City is, of course, about integration of mobility and sustainable energy production. So we will take a look at this transition path a bit more in detail in the next few slides. Transition part, electricity. Electricity plays a very important role when you want to go from fossil fuels to renewable energy. In our city, we want to get rid of natural gas. So we will need more electricity to heat our buildings and for induction cooking, for example. But also increasing digitization, especially in Amsterdam, that leads to a sharp rise in demand for electricity, as does, of course, electric mobility. And in order to become climate neutral, this electricity must be generated sustainably. Of course, we are part of an electricity mix, but also here we see it as our responsibility to at least do as much as we can to make this electricity mix sustainable. So sustainable production is an important pillar for us, as is infrastructure needed, and we will come to that later on in this presentation. So what are the possibilities to generate sustainable energy in a city like Amsterdam? It's not like that we have enormous amount of space, but we have enormous amount of spaces on the roofs in Amsterdam. If you looked at the former presentations in this webinars from SEEV4-City, you might have seen the presentation from Hugo Niesing from Resourcefully, and you saw that there's a lot of potential on these roofs. And we as a city, we want to use all this potential as much as possible to generate electricity. In cities like ours, it's necessary to make use of double space to efficiently use the space we have. And of course, the advantage of solar panels nowadays is that prices are lowering. It's quite straightforward. It's easy to install them. So we have opted for an approach whereby we want to inspire Amsterdam citizens, and we want to help them. We want to remove obstacles and allowing everybody in the city actually to make more effective use of their roofs to generate solar energy. And does this work? Well, the last few years, as you see in the graph, we have had more than 50% growth of solar panels within the city. And we aim to have to use 50% of all the suitable roof in Amsterdam by 2030. This means that we will have 2 million solar panels within the city at that time. And together with the wind energy that we want to generate around the city, we want to provide 80% of the households with sustainable electricity in 2030. So of course this will lead to more sustainable energy feed in the net in the city. And like I said before, on the other hand, we will have more demand of electricity coming from households, but especially also from electric mobility. And this is where my colleague Jaap will take over.
Yes, thank you, Art. So what we see is that Amsterdam is a attracting increasing numbers of residents, visitors, and workers. And that means a lot more mobility. And probably you know that Amsterdam is famous for bikes, but obviously there's a mix of mobility modes used there. So that means by road, by rail, water, also by air. And the city is growing too, meaning that the distances traveled are also getting longer. And this has implications for the pressure on our surroundings. And if we do nothing, it will lead to more carbon emissions. And by encouraging, facilitating, and where necessary, regulating the transition to sustainable transport, we are working to achieve fewer and especially cleaner vehicle kilometers. And cleaner means looking at the technology today, electric. And that means that this transition path, mobility, is specifically about decarbon emissions of passenger and goods transport in Amsterdam, and that we're also looking at ways to minimize the impact. So that follows two axes. The first one, limiting traffic. So we're looking at ways to minimize vehicle traffic within the city, moving people from cars to bikes and other modes of transport. And the second axis is greening all polluting vehicles and vessels. So that means making the switch to mostly to electric mobility. So we want to limit the growth in polluting vehicle kilometers. And we want to ensure that the traffic that remains is clean. And that will not only make Amsterdam cleaner and more peaceful, but it will also make the city more attractive and livable for everyone. We're also freeing up space in the city to make room for active modes of transport. So for pedestrians and cycling. And over the past few weeks, we've seen a lot of cities, not only in Europe, but also worldwide, using the same method. So taking away space on the streets that used to be for cars and dedicating this space again for bikes or pedestrian traffic. So especially in these times where we need social distancing, also social distancing on the street, that means that it's really important to have that physical space and that physical room available. So that's about the space, but then talking about the propulsion technology. So we'll have to make the transition to emission-free, reducing air pollution. So one way we're doing that in Amsterdam is using the Clean Air Action Plan that we launched last year. And it is a set of measures working towards the end goal of emission-free mobility by 2030. And Amsterdam has been working on emission-free traffic for over 10 years. So the Amsterdam Electric program, focusing on making most passenger cars electric within the city and also public transport, started 10 years ago. But now we're moving towards a next phase. And this new policy is about broadening our scope and accelerating. And that means we're making also tailor-made decisions for different target groups, so specific measures. So some of those measures include a environmental zone. So we're introducing a environmental zone for passenger cars by the end of this year. So that means that older gasoline cars will no longer be allowed within the 810 ring road, which is the larger part of the city. It also means that we're introducing more subsidies for emission-free vehicles so that more people can make the switch to a new and clean vehicle. We're working on public-private partnerships. So for instance, for city logistics, last mile delivery within the city center, we've signed up an agreement with all parties within the logistics spectrum to work together towards emission-free city distribution by 2022 and 2025, so that 2 steps towards emission-free logistics within the city center. We're also working on facilitating the right infrastructure, so that also means working on charging infrastructure to power those vehicles, boats, and cars as well. And that's obviously something that we as a city can't do alone. So we not only need charging infrastructure in place on street, but obviously also on working spaces, office buildings, private parkings. But let's focus a bit on public charging. So we actually estimate that we need to increase the number of public charge points within the city from roughly 3,700 today to 25 to 35,000 by 2030. And as you can see, we've seen a steady increase in the number of charge points operated and installed within the city of Amsterdam. There's a slight acceleration in the past year. And actually, we've made use of the more quieter streets during these interesting times of Corona to actually install more charge points. So that's why you can actually see a spike at the end of the graph. But we see more. So we're seeing also a transition if we look at the users of this public charging infrastructure. So over the past 10 years, we've seen quite a large share of public hybrid electric vehicles and also electric vehicles with a smaller battery. We're now seeing more and more bigger batteries in electric vehicles. And that's what we're seeing, that the amount of energy delivered at the charging stations is increasing even in a much sharper pace. So if we look at that on the next slide, you can actually see the real spike at the end of last year, where we actually could see the real introduction of a larger number of battery electric vehicles in the city. And that also means, obviously, there's more electricity being delivered at charging stations, and this electricity is delivered through a electricity grid. And not only electromobility needs this grid, but also other users on this electricity grid. And especially the pace of increase is a challenge for the grid. So the electricity grid has always been planned 20, 30, 50 years ahead with small incremental increases in energy consumption. But as you can see here, the increase in electric mobility is causing a sharp rise in electricity consumption. So we're seeing an increase in electricity need for mobility, but we're also seeing this for different segments.
Sure. Shall I take over again then, Jaap?
Yes.
And I'll go to, by the way, for the people really paying attention, you saw a sharp rise in the number of charging stations, but you see a sharp decrease in the use of electricity in the last month, also due to Corona, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So we've actually seen that. Luckily, people stay at home and don't use their car that often. So there's a slight increase over probably the last week, but still numbers are still really much lower than they used to be before.
Yeah. Okay. So on one hand we have the more sustainable energy coming into the grid, which we talked about before, and on the other hand we have more and more demand, and also peak demands, because besides the peak demands from the cars, which on average can be 10 times, it can be 10 times higher than the average peak demand for a household. I say average, but this average was on what the grid was designed so many years ago. So in an old city like Amsterdam, this can cause peaks which were not foreseen when the grid was designed. And like I said before, we want to get rid of natural gas also, and Amsterdam wants to get rid of the natural gas for heating and for cooking by 2040, which is 10 years before the national goal of 2050, which means that almost 80 or 90% of the buildings which are now heated by gas must be heated in another way, and this can be done by how do you call it? Heated water, but it also a lot of heat pumps will be used, of course, within the city. So this will lead to enormous peak demands as well. And we as a city, Amsterdam, and the local DSO Leander, we have recognized this as a potential threat, and we started to work together to get more insight in what this will mean for the grid. And we started calculating the effect of all the policies from Amsterdam, but not only sustainability, mobility, etc., but also all our urban plans. What if you put all together and you calculate what is needed from the grid? We see that the peak demand will increase by a factor 2 to 5. So this is quite large. And what does this mean for the grid? In this slide, you see different substations in Amsterdam, and you see that some of the traffic lights, they are red. Some of them, I must say, there are quite a lot of them are red. And this means that these substations, basically there's too much load on them by 2025 or 2030 if we don't take any action. So no need to say that action has to be taken. And from a city perspective, some people say, you could say that this is a problem of the DSO and not the city. But we work together on this study, and also within SEEV4-City or Flex Power for several reasons. And first of all, because we have our goals as a city for housing, for climate goals, and it must be facilitated by the grid. Another thing is spatial planning. We need space for additional infrastructure, and space is limited within the city. So we have to find this together. And third of all, if you can limit the infrastructural works, there will be less inconvenience for the people living in Amsterdam, and societal costs can be limited. So we see SEEV4-City as a part of the solution to limit these infrastructural works, to find the solutions, to use the grid efficiently. And by using the grid in the end in the most efficient way. So for us as a city, it was a very good thing to start this project 4 or 5 years ago, because now we have our learnings which we can introduce into our policies. And Jaap will tell you about the learnings we had.
Yes, so what we did in Amsterdam as part of SEEV4-City was a project that we call Flex Power. And it was or it is, because we're still actively conducting this pilot project. We're using 900 public charging points in the city to optimize them for both the grid impact as well as for local solar energy. And what we've learned is that it's that large-scale smart charging is feasible, and that it's beneficial for multiple stakeholders. And we don't have the time to go into the full details of this operational pilot here, but I'd like to point you to the previous presentation on the 6th of May that is available on the SEEV4-City website by Peter Bonds, and also the one before that by Robert van der Hoed and Hugo Niesing, as they've both presented the Flex Power pilot there. Also, the slides of those presentations are available on the SEEV4-City website as well. So I can recommend you to have a look at that. But to focus on the learnings. So the Flex Power pilot was a form of managed charging with no user interaction. So there was one profile for all charging sessions. And that also means that the potential for optimization was limited. We had to ensure that the negative effects of reducing charging power in the evening peak hours wasn't affecting mobility for users too much. So in general, we see that charging sessions show a great potential for even more flexibility, and it's just waiting to be unlocked. So what we see is that most people use charging infrastructure for either for overnight charging, so that means arriving in the late afternoon or early evening and leaving in the next morning, or arriving in the morning time and leaving in the evening time. And the second group obviously is the more interesting group to look at for optimizing for solar energy. So we've also learned that it's really feasible to optimize local solar energy consumption during daytime. And we've also learned that the evening peak pressure on the electricity grid can be reduced, especially when we look at electric vehicles. So those charging sessions can be easily postponed to a time really after this evening peak. And we've also learned that cars were being charged according to mobility needs of users, and that's obviously a must that we really need. So to sort of summarize what we've learned in this project, some learnings and recommendations, especially focusing on other municipalities or governments. So firstly, start early. Start early to work on the integration of mobility and energy policies. Start early with your pilots, because you need to learn and improve on the way. You don't know all the details when you start, and especially if you look at this technology, there's so much innovation taking place. If you wait for the golden innovation, then probably you can wait another 20 years. But if you start and you learn and you improve on the way, that gives really good insights. And it's the second thing we learned, it's really important to address the interaction of mobility and energy policies. These two domains have been separate for decades, but now within this wider framework of the energy transition, we see that there are no longer standalone topics. So we have to look at the integration of those two. Thirdly, smart charging. So smart charging is bringing together those two domains. So incorporate that in your city's policies. And again, make it adaptive, because you will learn by doing. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, cooperate and co-create together with charge point operators, with the grid operator, research institutions, because you will need them all to reduce the carbon emissions. And that's probably illustrated also by the image on the right-hand side. So we're all part of this greater machine that is that has the goal to reduce the carbon emissions. We can't do it alone as a city, and obviously we need all kinds of stakeholders.
Good.
Okay, it's from my side.
I think we can conclude from here, from the side from Amsterdam. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's correct. Looking at, are there some questions open to
There are
the
a
live?
few questions in the Q&A. Maybe we can pick a few of them. I see not all relevant for your topic. But there is one question. Amsterdam as a city has a larger budget than smaller cities. Do you have any advice for smaller cities? For example, 100,000 to 500,000 inhabitants, or all the learning scalable?
Can you say something? I guess most of the learnings are scalable. But if you look at for example, the charging infrastructure, Jaap, correct me if I'm wrong. We see that there are also possibilities to work together. We work together with other cities. They can learn from us. We can learn from them. But we also see smaller cities cooperate in placing charging infrastructure and choosing a charge point operator. And in this way, I think it's scalable.
And I'd like to add that you see that on smaller scale, you even see more active citizen communities, for instance, working on renewable energy production. And it's really interesting to make use of those active networks and see how you can work together with these groups to accelerate also your sustainable mobility plans. And obviously it doesn't have to be, if you're really a small city, then probably it's not about introducing a environmental zone, but you can definitely work together with stakeholders in your community to come up with smart charging strategies that benefit the local energy consumption, for instance.
Okay, good, thank you. I see two other questions, but they're very technical and not linked to the project in Amsterdam. So I want to thank you from here. We still have a video about Amsterdam, so we're gonna take kind of break here. We launch the video and we go from here. So hopefully this works technically fine. Here we go.
Amsterdam installed its first electric vehicle charging station in 2009. A year
Philip, I guess you have to unmute yourself.
I understood that there was an issue with the sound, so I can try over again.
Philip, if you mute yourself, the video is also muted.
We have time enough. I think it's only a short video, so we can try again.
Amsterdam installed its first electric vehicle charging station in 2009. A year later, the city already had 62 stations. Requesting one is very simple. First, an Amsterdam resident indicates a desire for a charging station. Then the city investigates whether the installation is possible. This request-driven procedure has led to over 3,000 charging stations being installed in the last decade. This benefits everyone in Amsterdam. After all, it results in cleaner air and a healthier place to live. That's wonderful news. Even more so once you realize that the electricity is generated sustainably and locally to Amsterdam. Step by step, Amsterdam is working towards a fully emission-free city in 2030. We're all helping to achieve the climate goals together. For this reason alone, electric cars are here to stay. The experts predict massive further adoption in the coming years. Fortunately, the charging stations keep getting smarter. They charge rapidly when the sun is out and more slowly at dinner time, when electricity usage is at its peak. This helps manage the electrical load on the grid. What will the charging network look like in another 10 years? Will there be special charging garages? Or will we charge our cars through lampposts or rubbish bins? Either way, Amsterdam is working hard on its charging network. An electric
Good. I hope this was more clear for everyone. So we go a bit further in our presentation. As mentioned already before, there is reports and new events coming up around SEEV4-City, and we would like to share this with you. So the next reports we are expecting the second half of June. So there will be reports of the pilot projects. They will be all available to download on the SEEV4-City website. This is the list of these reports. Some more can be defined now, but we're expecting a full date later on. Then there is an upcoming webinars from Avery itself. It's more about the post-COVID situation, the coming 3rd of June. Then there is on the 10th of June, Energy Meets Mobility. It's about the synergies in transportation hubs and smart charging pilots. Finally, there is also on the 24th of June, Policy Recommendations Validation webinar. This is organized by Polis and Avery during the Energy Days. There's a lot of information in these slides. Don't worry, you can find them back in the email that we'll share you at the end of the presentation for the coming days, at least. Or you can see them back in the shared presentations or in the video. This means that we can slightly go over to our next speaker, Richard. I made a mistake. It's Richard we had already. It's
yeah.
Chris. Chris.
Okay, hello.
Hello. Are you ready to share your screen?
Yes. So, where is that? I have my presentation open on my laptop, but it
We
when I
don't
press
see.
share screen, it doesn't seem to be there.
Try it over again.
There, maybe here. Now share screen. Share screen. I can see it in the Zoom window. I clicked on it, but it.
You have to confirm which share on the right side.
Okay.
Here we go. Thank you.
Okay.
I give the words to you, Chris.
Now, can people see this? Is this? I can't make it.
No, it is physical.
Yeah, but I can't seem to advance the slides. I don't know why that is. It is saying you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. So, what is?
I didn't touch anything.
You have my presentation. Is it possible for you to? Because the controls are not moving this slide forward.
I don't have it ready open, but meanwhile, while we are looking at that, we can do a poll, and we are, like in the other sessions, we are still curious where you're coming from. So please, people, let me know where you're coming from, and then meanwhile we can try to find the presentation of Chris.
Thank you.
So what expected? We see that most people, I can at least see already that most people are coming from Europe, but we have a quite mixed audience. So we'll end the poll now and share the results. Here we go. If the internet is want to do it. So 89% of the people is coming from Europe, and we have very little from Africa and Asia, and partly from North America. So pretty well. I have also another question, and that's more to know in which field you're working. Please let us know what your profession is. Also there, we have a very different public. I see the questions coming in. We go on for a few seconds longer. And I think we can conclude now. Yes. Here's the results. Gives you an impression. Biggest part is coming from the private enterprises. And then second group is apparently coming from the education or school part. So back to Chris.
I think I can.
Go on.
See, I can move it now, so I think I'm okay to go.
Good.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. So this is my presentation, e-mobility work and policies in Leicester. So it's just a disclaimer. So Leicester, this is a city in the East Midlands region of England. Greater Leicester population, that's the light blue shaded area in the center image there, is approximately 650,000 people. So like most cities and urban areas, we have a transport-related emissions problem. We have 80% of our nitrogen dioxide is from road transport, and approximately 25% of our carbon emissions are from transport. Now, fully electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles in electric mode, they can help here because they have zero tailpipe emissions. But of course, the electricity needs to come from clean and renewable sources, typically sun and wind. So as road traffic is a common source of NO2 and CO2, this brings us to the lower emissions concept. I'll just mention some of the elaborate on a couple of these examples of what that involves. On the parking policies, Leicester is updating its planning guidance regarding the number of charge points at car parks of different types and serving different developments. And currently in Leicester, there are approximately 160 public charge points. The council has put in approximately 30 of them, and the remainder are in our main shopping mall and in various supermarkets and hotels across the city. Now, the same range of measures can be used to address factors that affect the levels of NO2 and CO2, although the factors themselves differ somewhat. So looking at reducing NO2, here are the sort of areas of how we can act things, and sort of the e-mobility is possibilities are included in the green type there. We have seen recent improvements in air quality in Leicester, although we think this is less to do with e-mobility work so far, due largely to our partnership working with our bus companies in Leicester, initially, well, to introduce Euro 6 standard buses and to retrofit the exhaust systems of older vehicles with NOx abatement equipment. So looking at the CO2, the UK law now requires net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, and Leicester's ambition as a city is to be carbon neutral by 2030. We are on track to halve our citywide CO2 emissions on a 1990 baseline by 2025. As yet, there are not enough electric vehicles in Leicester to see their contribution. However, in 2017, when Leicester as a council was operating 17 electric vehicles, we did an emissions comparison. We made an emissions comparison with the diesel equivalents of those electric vehicles, and we scaled that to the intended replacement figure of 110 vehicles. And this showed a full switch to electric vehicles would save 85 tons of carbon per year. So our early work on e-mobility. I say, yeah, we have 30 charge points for the public installed at 6 of our council car parks across the city. They went in between 2012 and 2014. We've seen an increase in patronage at those charge points at all locations, but at 3 sites there is pronounced growth. Lessons we will take forward for future such installations is the need for the support of publicity and marketing initiatives to drive people towards electric mobility, and the need for the charge points to operate to pay-as-you-go access rather than membership schemes. On the right there, we've got some electric vans for the council. They're popular with our drivers, and the electric vans and cars we have so far and the charge points have proved reliable. This year, we expect to double our electric fleet to around about 30 vehicles, still cars and light vans at present. We feel it's important for the council to lead by example. We have had no range problems operating in the city area so far, and in 4 years of operation, we've had no need to replace batteries. Current work, Leicester is offering grants towards the cost of an electric vehicle. This is an initiative part funded by the ERDF. A key target group within the grants we're offering are taxi drivers to help them switch out from diesel vehicles to electric. A lot of the early grant allocations have been to help purchase hybrid electric taxis ahead of fully electric versions now becoming available. But even an electric hybrid can perhaps introduce passengers, give passengers their first experience of how smooth and quiet an electric vehicle ride is. Now in cities, urban areas where there's high density living, this often comes with a lack of off-street parking. And if home is the most popular place to charge a car, but there's no off-road charging facility, this could be a barrier to buy an electric vehicle. So we did a public exercise engagement and we identified 17 sites, 17 sites in residential areas which lack off-street parking, but where residents already had an electric vehicle, were very interested in buying one. So of these 17 sites, 12 of these are going to be provided by single socket lamp columns, like illustrated in the picture there. This becomes possible because the lamp columns are all converted to LED operation, but the existing cables remain and they have some spare capacity in them. And that capacity can provide a maximum power rating of 5.7 kilowatts to charge the car. Now that's quite slow, but if you're at home and you're charging overnight, that'll give you a good charge. So what is the developing government policy on e-mobility and tackling climate change and improving air quality? Earlier this year, they've launched a sort of big consultation document with a lot of new ideas in here. The paper recognizes the associated benefits of a bold action to tackle transport emissions. Those including improved health, better places to live and to be, and a strong driver for clean economic growth and the new job opportunities that will be contained within that. However, success requires that the transport sector embrace new technology and innovation like never before. Support for transition to zero emission road vehicles will include a supportive regulatory environment to back up, to keep the pressure on the manufacturers and so on to really deliver the required technology and at the scale that's required. But also there needs to be a strong consumer base developed by building trust in new technologies as providing a viable alternative to fossil fueled vehicles. So if electric vehicles are to be mainstreamed, where will all this extra electricity come from? Now, this is going back to a lot of the stuff that Richard was mentioning. There's an increased role for decentralized renewable generation, for example, solar panels. But there's also important that that energy is used in an intelligent and smart way. And again, this brings up the concept of vehicle for energy services, the use of an electric vehicle to support the energy needs of a building or indeed the grid itself. And this here, this is going to be the Leicester's SEEV4-City project at a vehicle to building project at our City Hall headquarters. We have 4 Nissan Leafs in this project. Now currently at the end of their working day, they charge using peak price electricity. They're fully charged by late evening, even mid-evening, but they're not needed till the following morning. So the vehicle to building system has 3 operational phases. By day, top-up charging, and we will monitor when the cars are charging and see how much solar generation there is at that time to get an idea of how much solar energy is going in that charge. In the evening, the 4 electric vehicles are available for a controlled discharge to City Hall between 4 p.m. and 11 p.m. That's the Duros red and amber periods. And that helps with the City Hall baseload, which is up to 40% of daytime because of all the electrical systems, the service and so on. And then overnight, the cars recharge from the mains, but on a cheaper rate. Expected outcomes are an increase of ultra-low emission kilometers traveled, a reduction in the carbon intensity and the improved cost profile of our electric vehicle operations. And this will all help avoid the need for grid strengthening because we're helping to flatten the demand curve. I'll just say that in my presentation at the first of these webinars on the 22nd of April, I go into more of the technical details of this project. So we have to keep an eye on the climate change, and Leicester is one of many cities across the world that has declared a climate emergency. Council officers have produced a vision of how we think Leicester will need to be as a carbon neutral and climate adapted city. And we produced a list of potential actions which could help achieve this vision. We got the views of a cross-section of Leicester's population, and regarding e-mobility actions, there was good support. I'll just give 3 examples. Public transport providers to replace their fleets with ultra-low emission vehicles, 91% supported that. Governments to continue and to increase grants to individuals and businesses for purchasing ultra-low emission vehicles and installing charge points, 86% supported that. And finally, those with electric vehicles and solar panels to buy vehicle-to-grid equipment to store and trade renewable energy via the electric vehicle battery. And although this is a new concept to many, 74% saw that as a good idea. So 2 more slides. We produce a local transport plan, our key strategic plan for our transport operation, and we're developing our new one right now. Congestion is a problem for all cities and urban areas, and during the peak hours this congestion causes poor air quality and an increase in carbon emissions. So without significant investment in sustainable transport, this will only get worse as our city grows. We believe an electric business as usual will not be the answer to congestion. Just filling the streets with electric cars isn't the solution to congestion. The Decarbonising Transport Policy paper I showed earlier states that public transport and active travel, walking and cycling, will be natural first choices in the future. There is huge potential to increase the amount of active travel, but substantial need will remain for motor vehicles, public transport, private transport, delivery vehicles and so on, and increasingly this will need to be electric. So final slide, on the left there, in 2021, all of our park and ride services will change to electric vehicle operation. And at appropriate sites, we anticipate installing solar panels and static storage to help charge both the buses and the electric vehicles parked there. In 2024, we expect to have 12 electric metro buses operating on key routes within Leicester with a high frequency, 10-minute frequency. And finally there on the right, we're currently looking at feasibility studies to installing solar car portals on the top roof of 2 city centre car parks. And again, the intention is that the solar energy contributes to the charging of the electric vehicles parked there. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for the insights of Leicester. I think we can go straight ahead with Sture Bortvik from Oslo. We go to Norway. Sture.
Yep.
You're there. Welcome this afternoon in this session of the SEEV4-City webinar.
Thank you.
Do we manage to get your screen alive?
Yeah. Can you see the presentation?
Not yet, no.
Not yet. Okay. Just a second.
Yes, it's
okay. Good.
Here we are.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be here. Yeah, in Oslo, we are also looking at how we can reduce our emission like everybody else. And of course, we think the key is electrification. Electrification of all kinds of transport. At the moment, it's a new national plan, Climate Cure 2030, good name. And also the city has its self-climate strategy 2030. Also, we have made an analysis by the Institute of Transport Economics, a 360-degree analysis showing how that can be possible. So, well, the focus is on transport. You can see here is a listing of all kinds of CO2 measures. And the transport is by far the biggest focus because it represents close to 50% of all emissions in the city when it comes to CO2. So within a few years, 100% of all new cars have to be battery electric, and also 100% of all light freight vans. So that's quite ambitious because it's not so far from now, but it will happen. And also 100% of all new heavy freight trucks has to be battery electric, but that's in 2030. And yeah, there are mentions a lot of different. And electric means, of course, battery electric or hydrogen. Both are viable options. Okay, you have a lot of electric cars in Oslo at the moment, coming back to that, but the recipe for making this happen has been that an EV must be cheap to buy, no purchasing tax, no VAT, cheap to use, free parking and so on, but also convenient and pleasant for the users. And of course, you also need the right product. That's why it took a little time, because all the incentives were actually in place in the 90s, but first in 2011 did things happen. And at the moment, what is the situation? Well, 76% of all new cars sold so far this year is electric. Last year it was 68%. This means that 3 out of 4 new cars sold are now electric. So it's quite good. It's not rocket science, but it shows that green taxes are actually working. But you have to make it affordable for common people to take green choices. There are some challenges, of course. To the right, you can see a typical newspaper article saying opptatt, 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 which is Norwegian, means occupied, occupied, occupied. So it's good, but there are challenges. Okay, here you can see over last year how actually the zero emission part is actually close to 80%. So things are moving extremely fast, and that's important to say. So far this year, 76% is electric, battery electric in Oslo. And there are a small fraction also plug-in hybrids. Yeah, but it's a lot of electric. Okay. Then is the question, is sky is the limit or trouble in paradise? Sometimes I feel a little bit like the lady to the right running after the train in the morning, and you are a little short of time. And every morning the train is going faster and faster. Of course, the growth itself is a big challenge because the EV sales are boosting. And to be honest, we have moved from a situation where we had 1 charger per every 4 cars just a couple of years ago. Now it's 1 to 28, and that's a little bit too little. Coming back to that, 61% is also living in multifamily buildings, a little bit like Amsterdam and other cities in urban Europe. People don't have necessarily their own parking possibilities and charging possibility. So that's a big challenge. Also, electrification for professional uses of EVs are also a challenge, coming back to that. So we have some solutions, and that is more fast chargers, indoor parking garages, of course, where Vulcan and the Fortress is 2 of the biggest ones. We need to build like centers of excellence for professional users of EVs, because that's lagging a little bit behind. And also we need fossil-free public transportation. That will happen in 2028. All buses, all trams, everything will be electric, even the boats. And we have to make sure that everybody can charge at home. That's the challenge. So in order to make that happen, last year we gave grants to housing associations. On the right, down to your right, you can see on the picture a typical housing association. For the first time, this cooperative sees an EV charger, and they wonder how can we serve our tenants in our housing corporation. Well, last year we made sure that if you apply, the city will actually help you. So 20,000 chargers last year and 20,000 in 2018. So that's good. But of course, not everybody have their own parking spot. Especially if you live downtown Oslo, then you need public chargers. So here are some examples, also an electric bus in the background to the left. So we are doing them as well. At the moment, 1,600, so that's far less than Amsterdam, but we are speeding up. And we have a lot of quick, fast chargers, so rapid, quick chargers in the city. So that also helps. But we need new green mobility houses. Here you can see some examples from Vulcan. This is part of the SEEV4-City project. Down to the right, you have our governing mayor together with our deputy mayor for transport. Up to the left, she's opening Vulcan. To the right, it's the Fortress charging garage. The Vulcan project itself is Norway's biggest charging garage, 102 charging points. The whole premises have geothermal heating. We have included smart gridding and loading system, and all grid connections are supervised and balanced. We have flexible charging, which means that you as an EV driver can just plug in and you can ask for 7.4, 11 kilowatt or whatever your car is capable to cope with. And that's a new thing to do, and also we price them a little bit different. We also have, of course, rapid chargers at the site, and also we have developed a system for pre-booking for professional users. We also have a battery storage to shave the peaks in the morning time to check out how that is working as good as we need to shave the peaks. Residential parking during nighttime makes a reason because it used to be quite empty in the evening time. At the same time, we need to offer parking and charging possibility for people living downtown. So Vulcan became a kind of dualistic structure where professional users could use it at daytime and residents and private person during the nighttime. Also, everything is prepared for vehicle to grid. All the cablings are ready to go. And of course, we have tested out a lot of new business models. Car sharing companies, we used to have one, now we have 4. Also, we have a cycling garage. Vulcan, here are some slides. What we can see, and that's quite interesting, is that over 100,000 kilowatt hours are charged every month. So that really saves a lot of CO2 emissions. Also, it makes it easier for people, for the professional users, to have a place where they know they always will find a free charging spot for the taxi drivers and so on. So we are very happy for SEEV4-City who contributed to make this happen. So I think in the future we need more of this. So yeah, that was short, but yeah.
Thank you, Sture. Thank you for your contribution on this. I see I had one question that popped up, which was actually really relevant, I think, for the Oslo case. What's the plans with the current internal combustion engine cars that are on the roads in 2025? How does the government see this?
Well, we will not put them in jail, to put it like that. Of course, what we want is to stop sales of combustion cars after 2025. And exactly how we are going to do that, because that's a national regulation, it's not only in the city of Oslo, but it's general. It will be either, I don't think it will be a use of force, it will be a use of the price mechanism. It will simply be too expensive to buy a diesel car in 3 years from now. So people won't do it. Of course, if they already bought the car, that's something else. They will can still use it, but they have to pay a lot, and increasingly so, every time they pass in the toll ring in and out of the city. Also, they have to pay higher insurance. They have to pay a lot for parking and so on. And if you pass through Oslo, you will pass through, in worst case, like 58 different toll stations where you have to pay a lot if you have a old combustion car. So people won't do that, I guess. So yeah.
I have one question coming up, which actually interested myself as well. It's about the charging pilot projects on the wireless taxi charging points.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think it will be a game changer, because my experience with the taxi drivers is that they want things to be as smooth and easy as possible. Of course, time is money. So if they can just stop at the taxi rank and put their car in park, and after 6 split seconds, they will start to charge, and then they can advance when it's their turn to move in the crowd. I think that's is a potential game changer, not only for the taxis in the future, but also for craft and service vehicles, and potentially also for the buses and trucks. But we will start this autumn with the taxi projects. So we will make sure that if you're driving the right vehicles, you have a lot of the most attractive taxi stands in the city will be only for zero emission taxis, because all the taxis within 2024 have to be zero emission. So we will start and we will see. But we will not only go for one technical solution, which is wireless, which I personally think is extremely interesting, but we will have also at the same time the possibility for traditional rapid chargers, quick chargers.
Okay, thank you. Very great.
Yeah, thank you.
From Oslo and Norway, of course.
Thanks.
And we go to our last speaker, Jason Dong. Welcome. You are my colleague handling all the policy matters.
Thank you, Philippe. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, I see your screen, and if you put it in full presentation mode.
Yeah, you can see everything. Perfect. I will start then. Thank you, Philippe, for the introduction. Thank you to all who have made it to the final presentation of the final series of our webinars. I will touch, as people have mentioned, on the EU's role in enabling V2G and smart charging. I will touch on what's already been done kind of in the past couple of years, and then going to the Green Deal, kind of explain what specifically has been proposed that will impact the uptake and the development of V2G and smart charging in general. But a little bit about us before that. For those of you who don't know us, we're the European Association for Electromobility. On top of a strong electromobility industry, we obviously strive for an independence of fossil fuels, clean, quiet, and healthy cities, and energy efficient transports. So diving right in. So the clean energy package was something, for those of you who don't know about it, was something that came before the Green Deal back in 2018. It was agreed upon finally, only last year, it was legislation essentially that created, or part of it, I guess, was part of that created a flexible, fair, transparent electricity markets. The two pieces of legislation specifically within this overall legislative package were legislation directed at electricity markets and regulation on it, the electricity markets. And so relevant for our discussions for the SEEV4-City project are these two aspects that, again, enabled customers to have direct contracts with aggregators. So aggregators being anybody not your electricity supplier. There are some independent aggregators today that operate in Europe who will then take essentially your flexible load from your electric car to sell it on the grids, to balance the grids. So those, before that, there were no direct right in European legislation for that to happen. And member states also had to facilitate the connection of charging points to distribution networks. So if we're further to what my colleagues from Amsterdam said about having actually good relationships between CPOs and DSO, the distribution network operators, this is now mandated and mandated within the legislation so that member states remove these barriers and ensure that this cooperation is basically facilitated. An additional aspect that was kind of included within the clean energy package is this mandating that every final customer is able to have a dynamic electricity price from their supplier. If we look at this graph, which is from the Regulatory Assistance Project and Octopus Energy, you can actually see that this, if we are incentivizing consumers to have this kind of dynamic tariff, it actually falls very quickly in line with how we think about smart charging. If we think about all the presentations, all the projects that have talked about smart charging, and when we want to incentivize smart charging, and if you kind of put the graphs over each other, you would see that in line, that dynamic tariffs are actually key to having smart charging. So if we want to delay charging to times during the night, you would actually pay less for that smart charging rather than when you would have during these red lines when it would be more expensive here between 17 o'clock and 22 o'clock. So it falls in line with this whole thinking about smart charging and when to delay actually when to charge your vehicle. So it actually will be a very strong enabler for people to save money on their electricity bills every month from the consumer angle. And now after, last year we were proposed with the European Green Deal. We want to have 90% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from transport by 2050. On top of that, we initially aimed for 13 million charging points by 1 million charging points by 2025 for the assumed 13 million by 2025 electric cars or zero emission cars. Now that has been, with Corona, with COVID-19, that has been changed a little bit. For those of you who are unaware, the European Commission is currently devising how to revise these targets for a stronger recovery so we can support the zero emission mobility sector. So there's currently some thinking that this 1 million charging points target by 2025 might be revised upwards, which would definitely help, of course, the e-mobility sector. So that's just some insight into the ongoing discussions right now. As part of the Green Deal, there was something called the Smart Sector Integration Strategy. This is very much a broad communication piece that is expected over the summer to be announced. It will essentially look at how to integrate the energy and transport sectors more in depth. That comes from policymaking and in general, an integration of these two sectors, because before that, we've seen, at least at the European Commission level, a lot of, let's say, policymaking that's been treated the transport sector and the energy sector a bit in silos. And now they have this thinking to have more streamlined thinking to include both sectors and to create a strategy that will help the development of these two areas. And this, of course, is important for V2G and smart charging. Some recommendations from the Envera side is we need to keep to ensure that within the strategy we have demand side flexibility to manage the energy system, which fosters flexible loads like V2G, like smart charging. If you see this graph down below here, you essentially see this overall, this smart sector integration. So it's not just mobility, but it's also electricity generations fostering renewable energy, power to heat for buildings and industry. If you think about it, if we had a stronger strategy, or once we have this stronger strategy in place, if we think about taking the SEEV4-City projects in mind, Flex Power, Loughborough, the Vulcan pilots, and even the Amsterdam Arena, these are key for these kinds of projects to develop and to be duplicated in other kind of projects that are ongoing right now. Moving on, there's another aspect of this is the Energy Taxation Directive. This is an old taxation directive that was created back in 2003, I believe. So definitely does not take into account the current system, the current different innovations that have come since then. So currently within this file, their EV batteries are only considered as kind of consumption points. They were never taken into account that they could provide energy to the grid. So right now, given that they are only seen as consumption points, you will be taxed to take that energy from the grid, and then you'll be taxed again, sending it back to the grid once you provide that flexibility. Once we get to that point where consumers and commercial kind of buildings will be able to do so. So in essence, right now, if you wanted to do this, you would pay double grid fees. Of course, it's not commercialized yet, but that's why we need to address this file right now. So we need to obviously ensure that you only have a tax exemption if you're trying to sell that when you're using that, flexibility, and you obviously want to have favorable kind of electricity for off-peak and off-peak times, so that again, when you want to sell it during off-peak times, like in the night, you don't have that same kind of taxation burden that you would currently see right now if we were doing this at scale. So again, linking it back to the project, to the SEEV4-City pilots, if we think about that, I believe it's the Leicester project where we have that smart home. If we had that person who currently works for Cenex wanting to sell that electricity back to the grid, he would be taxed 2 times. Another aspect of the European Green Deal is the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive, this file that was agreed upon in 2013, which didn't take into account smart charging and V2G, obviously, because those aspects were not kind of included at that time. So within this revised file, which we expect to come in early 2021, we will definitely be pushing for charging infrastructure that has smart charging capabilities within public domains. Another aspect that this file will actually look at is the possibility to support the booking of charging points and to enable smart charging in not only in private kind of or parking garages, but more public environments. So this would be key, for instance, for the Vulcan pilot, where you're able to book your charging point in advance. And secondly, it would enable you to kind of delay charging at a certain point if you realize that the grid is, if you're, a private company realizes that, and you're able to play within your essentially your charging times. So this is definitely something that would help smart charging and V2G in the future. Lastly, one of the key files as well is the batteries directive. So on top of battery data and second life, this battery directive it's going to be a revision to be coming in the fall of this year. And it will probably be a huge major flagship initiative, which will not just touch on battery data and second life, but the entire sustainability, end-of-life aspect of batteries. So it's going to be, I think, one of the largest and most complex files to be decided at EU level. But of relevance to V2G and smart charging is this whole aspect of battery data. It's been talked about in our previous webinars. It's been talked about in the sector for the past couple of years. People wondering what will happen to battery data. Will we be able to get access to that on a commercialized level? And so this is going to be the piece of legislation that will regulate that, the access to this in-vehicle data, and giving market actors the state of health and adapting the charging processes. As well, it will also deal with second life aspects. So second life is currently not, again, defined within the framework of this legislation, but we expect that it will be at a certain point, because right now it's not legally defined, and therefore could create a lot of regulatory uncertainty in the future. So what should we include, or sorry, to touch on this as well, there's also warranty and extended producer responsibility issues that are quite key and quite important for V2G and smart charging. So if you think about it, and if you look at this graph down below, when a car is scrapped, it needs to also, we need to understand, is there enough battery recovery to do second life? If so, then it needs to be repurposed and it needs to go through certain processes. Right now within the current file and currently in the market, there's very insufficient clarity as to, let's say, if there was an issue with the battery, if there was potential for that battery to catch fire, for instance, in a second life capacity, would it be the original OEM or car manufacturer or the producer of the battery that would be at fault for that battery taking fire, or would it be the person who sells it at the end of its second life? So these kind of questions are very much at the core of the batteries directive as well. And again, so where do we see from a various point of view what could help sort out this regulatory uncertainty? One is the battery passports. So the battery passport is a concept that was floated by the Global Battery Alliance, but really for sustainable, tracking sustainability data. So it would look at, for instance, raw materials, understanding what raw materials were in that passport, where the raw materials have come from. But we see that this battery passport would be a possibility to give various stages of access. So on top of the sustainability data, you would have battery data like state of health, like state of charge, that only certain market actors would be able to access, wouldn't be open to all, because again, we know that the OEMs consider this to be commercial data, which is proprietary. But if we give access to certain people on different conditions, we can still incentivize V2G while also getting the OEMs on board. With the second life aspect, we obviously need to create this definition to support new business models like vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, vehicle to business. And lastly, sorting out this extended producer responsibility and warranty issues. If we can create, again, these rules of responsibility for all market actors, then we create, again, this opportunity for the market to take off. So out of all of the kind of pieces of legislation I discussed, from our point of view, the batteries directive will probably be one of the most important files to come this year, and to come within the overarching kind of Green Deal that looks at all aspects of reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. Lastly, if you feel that any of these pieces of legislation will impact you, will impact your company in general, we're happy to provide you with input, with access to kind of policymakers in this area to support your business case. Feel free to get in touch with us directly, or myself directly as the policy manager. Thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Philippe.
Thank you, Jason. Very different insights on European level. Very valuable, in my opinion. So we need them for sure. This means that we are ending our seminar today. We had exciting speakers during the last weeks. We had a lot of insights, and this doesn't mean that our work is finished from now on. There is still a lot of work to deliver. There is still a lot of challenge to go for. I want to thank all of you. If there's any questions that you still want to address, please use the email addresses. Please take the contact page on the SEEV4-City website. We are continuing our work, and we are believing in a sustainable future with, of course, sustainable transport. Thank you all. Look forward to meet you in another way than in a seminar. Great to have you here. Goodbye.